However bleak I found the difficulties of everyday life at home, and however much I actually longed to be back at the front and with my comrades, it was still hard for me to say goodbye. As always at the end of the leave, Mother had not come with me to the station. I could not bear our feelings, especially those of my dear mother, to be watched by strangers. Mother knew that. She always swallowed her tears and stayed behind at home. With a bag of freshly washed clothes in my hand, I left the house. Mother waved to me from the window for a long time. In Vienna, I struggled to get from the Northwest Railway Station to the Northern Railway Station. The platform, as I was used to by then, was full of soldiers, women and children, all saying goodbye. Throughout the entire journey from Stockerau, I had an anxious New Year's Eve feeling. Vienna's formerly peaceful appearance, where only blackout precautions reminded you of war and danger from the air, had been lost. It had become a city behind the lines. The front ran through Gran and by Lake Balaton. As the leave train slowly moved out from the platform, I was depressed by the tears and the pain of farewells that I saw around me. In the dark New Year's night, my thoughts raced ahead into the new year and what it might bring. The Reich was gripped by its enemies on its eastern and western borders. In East Prussia, the Russians had touched the soil of the Reich and committed unimaginable atrocities. During my leave, almost daily, hundreds of American bombers had flown over our small town, down the Danube, towards Vienna. Standing at the doors of their houses, many inhabitants had watched the great aircraft taking their course, unopposed, with imposing equanimity. Father, in his Christmas letter to Mother, had told her if the worst came to the worst to stay where she was. Rudy and I had pressed her to flee in any event if the Russians came. We had even put together, for her and for little Liesel, some light baggage for that eventuality. A stroke of good fortune let our father return home just at the right time. That removed from her the responsibility for taking a decision, and both parents did the right thing in not fleeing. In Thorn, I left the leave train. It was going on to Königsberg. I changed to the passenger train to Sichelberg. There, Lieutenant Brinkel, the first orderly officer of the regiment, got on. By profession, he was a Protestant pastor in Silesia. At midnight, he had heard the Führer's address promising victory to our armed forces. It was full of optimism. The railway ended in Nasielsk, 6 kilometers behind the front. Brinkel and I marched together to the divisional command post. It was a gleaming white winter's day. The sun illuminated the Sunday peace, and the war, for once, was still. At the divisional staff, everybody apart from the guard was still asleep. They had been celebrating New Year, and the divisional adjutant, Major Ostreich, had to get out of bed on our account. He said we could have stayed at home to see in the New Year. That was easily said. My leave ended on New Year's Eve, and that was when I had to begin the journey. Quite apart from that, I could not have celebrated knowing that the next day I would have to travel to the Eastern Front for the 4th time. The nearer the front I came, the more I had the familiar feeling of butterflies. But there was some compensation in the fact that I was back with the 7th. I looked up Klaus Nicolai. We had a quick welcome nip and went to the bunker of the regimental commander. Oberst Dorn, the Grand Seigneur from the Rhineland, welcomed me to the regiment and informed me that I was to get the 1st company. The company was at the moment in reserve in the so-called second trench of the extended trench system. The next day it would move back into the front line. At the 1st Battalion, Hauptmann Fitz and Oberleutnant Kullenberg, the Hauptmann and the adjutant, welcomed me with a loud hello. I knew them from the previous summer. Then a runner took me forward, and at the company I was welcomed by Lieutenant Martin Lechner, who was to take over command of the battalion's heavy weapons company. I had become friends with Lechner in spring 1944 in Schweidnitz. At that time he had come from the war school to which he had been sent as an active Unteroffizier with above-average potential. He had good manners, and you could not see the 12-ender in him, even if at the Ersatz battalion he had not had any comrades. I had put myself out a bit for him, for which I noticed he had been grateful, but we celebrated our reunion with the appropriate drop of the hard stuff. Before that, of course, we had done another tour of the bunker. I had to see and greet the men. They should get a look at their new bosses straight away. After that, we sturdily went on to have a few jars, because that was still the best tried and tested way of getting things off to a good start. Finally, Lechner got up and made a speech on the theme that the 1st company must be the first. not only in name but also in achievement, something it was now and also must remain in the future, not quite so awkwardly and seriously as Lechner. I also said a few words to him and to the men of the company. I stressed my pride at now being commander of the first company of our old regiment, and that was the truth. The next night we moved into position in the Naas von Povelin. It was extremely unfavourable, because the main line of resistance ran at a right angle, one arm pointed in a westerly and the other arm in a southerly direction. The Russians could come from two sides. In the intersection of the angle, enemy fire was possible from three sides. Our neighbour on the right was the second company. On the left was the divisional Fusilier battalion. Only 100 metres of the trench had been dug out to knee depth, so that during the daytime you could only move through it by crawling. Because of the way the trenches ran in the entire Naas, the men of the company regarded themselves, in the event of the expected large-scale enemy offensive, as written off. With almost complete certainty, those in the Naas could expect to be overrun or cut off. As far as anyone could see, there was no way of escape. Fire could come from three sides, attacks from two sides, and to the rear in front of the second line were our own minefields, only passable in narrow channels. Whoever survived the heavy barrage before the attack had to face the attack itself. Scarcely anybody would be able to survive that. Because of the minefields and the completely open, gently rising terrain, to retreat did not offer the slightest prospect of getting through in one piece. Thoughts like this I had to keep to myself, and particularly the thought that, if the worst came to the worst, I had only my own pistol to keep me out of the Russian captivity that I viewed with such fear and horror. During those days, or rather nights, I was continually moving around the trench from post to post and bunker to bunker, in order to get to know every one of the men under my charge. Many knew me by sight, many by name. Actions like Upolossi, Nemes and Rasanen and many others bound us together. Also, I spoke the language of the Silesians, who still formed the majority of the regiment. I was able to converse with them in their local dialect, so that none of them felt that I was a stranger. Soon after I joined the regiment, I had learned to speak Lower Silesian and Upper Silesian. Once, on an exercise march in the vicinity of the garrison, an old dear had said to me that I was certainly a Schweidnitzer. Telling her that I was not, I had laughed at her, and she had got angry. My company troop leader was the young Berlin Unteroffizier Ulrich Lamprecht. He was a student of Protestant theology with the Iron Cross First Class on his narrow chest. Every day he read the Book of Proverbs of the Herrenhut Brethren. In the days that remained until the offensive, I read the Proverbs with him, and also the corresponding references from the New Testament, which I had in my pack. Among the runners, Walter Buck stood out. He was a 35-year-old businessman from Hamburg. He matched the type of the intelligent soldier who has long since passed normal military age and who lacked the ambition of youth. He was reliable and did his duty well, as did the other runner Reinalter, a farmer from Swabia. As in all the earlier trenches, in this trench too some branch trenches led to the separate Donnerbalken or Thunderbox. It was the one little place where you could be alone at the front. In that quiet hermitage you could, if it suited the enemy, actually spend the quietest minutes of the day or night. In summer as in winter there was the smell of the chlorine. Then, in the icy cold of winter, strange towers, frozen stiff, stood up in the pit as in a dripstone cave. It was then that I decided, if I was granted a happy return home and had the opportunity, I would somehow sing the praises of the latrines, which I have now done here. The company command post lay on slightly rising ground, in the middle of the bridge of the Naas. The linking stretch leading to the main trench could be seen by the enemy during the daytime. Therefore, if at all possible, we had to remain in the bunker. In that way, during the long days up to the 14th of January, I learned how to play skat. I never had any interest in card games. Many a time comrades or superiors had asked, "Can you play skat, or can you play Doppelkopf?" When I said no, it usually prompted the surprised and amused question, "Hey lad, how did you get to be an officer then?" On the 6th of January, I had the great surprise of seeing a schoolmate from Stockerau, Lieutenant de Reserve Otto Holzer. In the autumn he had passed out of war school, and came as a platoon leader into the heavy weapons company. It was a huge pleasure for me, even if our time together during the evenings did not last long. Subsequently, after Otto was wounded in February, we did not see each other again. A visit of another kind was the assignment of a trench dog. Not the designation for a new weapon or machine. It was an actual guard dog. It had been selected to alert us to alien elements in the trench. It was a smallish, wolf-like mongrel, and despite my love for dogs, I had no confidence in its military value as an additional defense against the ever-active Russian commando units. On the 9th of January, I received orders to prepare an assault unit to bring in prisoners. It was to be led by me because I was the most experienced of the company commanders. The order, and above all the fact that I was to lead the assault unit, did not comfort me at all. I still did not feel myself to be sufficiently familiar with the terrain. I would also be responsible for the operation. There were others who had not yet had the opportunity to win a decoration. I spoke about it openly with Martin Lechner, who agreed with me entirely. But the assault unit was called off on the 12th of January, after it had been announced that the Russians had begun their large-scale offensive. With 3,000 tanks, they moved up from the Vistula bridgeheads of Baranov and Walker. Those were the omens as I faced my 21st birthday the next day. I celebrated it, therefore, on the evening of the 12th, in the expectation that from 12 midnight on the 13th, a special feeling of consecration would set in, befitting the significance of the fact that I had attained my coming of age as a citizen. On the 13th of January, the enemy's major offensive in East Prussia began. It was still quiet where we were. There was harassing fire of varying strength and noise, and from time to time snatches of songs from the enemy trenches. With the field kitchen came best wishes and the usual bottles as presents. The general, the divisional adjutant, the commander and the commanders of the artillery regiment whom I knew, Oberst Dorn and the battalion commanders all sent their congratulations. I was touched by the expressions in them of the respect and esteem in which my achievements were held. In the light of what faced us, the wishes were of particular warmth and sincerity. Unfortunately, the mail that I used to send them all home was lost. Unexpressed, but certainly honourably meant, was the wish that Lieutenant Roberts had expressed to me in the summer in Raseinen. When we were saying goodbye to each other, as we were changing positions, he squeezed my hand and, smiling sadly, no doubt with the premonition that he was to die soon, said, "Stay alive." He had been killed in action in October on the Narev. At 6 p.m. the company commanders received their orders at the battalion. Since Hauptmann Fitz had left in the night after he had been wounded, Oberleutnant Husenet, wearing the Knight's Cross, had taken over command of the battalion. I had gone off with the runner, Buck, and the dog. At the battalion command post, we had learned more about the serious situation in the Vistula bridgeheads and in East Prussia. There was no longer any doubt about the fate that awaited us. On the way back, I went with the runner into the completely destroyed village church of Powilin. It had been a quite simple little old wooden church, but the tower had been shot off during the recent fighting. One single token remained to remind you of its religious purpose, namely a large cross on the side of the altar. "Thy will be done," I could have no better prayer. When I got back to the company, I strode once again from bunker to bunker, and went from post to post to give everyone one more word of confidence. On the morning of the 14th of January, as we had since the morning of the 12th, we were expecting from hour to hour the beginning of the heavy barrage. According to the custom of the Russians recently, the thunderclap was to be expected on the hour, that is at 6 a.m., 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. After we had been spared the unavoidable event on the 12th and the 13th, the beginning had to be today, because the long-observed preparations of the enemy allowed for no other possibility. They would have to get as far as possible in daylight after the effect of their devastating fire. It would last several hours and would land on our positions. Their attack would necessarily have to be as early as possible. Thus, the preparatory fire would also have to begin very early in the morning. I was with the men of my company in the bunker. We were lying or sitting on bunkers or at small tables, weapons and steel helmets ready to hand. An all-consuming nervousness that no one let show dominated us. A cold feeling crept over me, that trembling in the stomach that used to affect me in school before exams. But when at 7 a.m. the fire did not erupt, I hoped that the Russians would today be sparing us once again. The feeling was reinforced because even on the dot of 8 a.m. by my service watch, nothing happened. But just as I was about to say what I was thinking, there began the dreadful crashing, the familiar noise of Stalin organs firing. Several of them must have been firing in sequence, because the crashing went on for what seemed an eternity. Only within the detonations of the organ shells did the barking reports of cannons and those of howitzers, mortars, and the Ratschbum sound out. The earth was literally shaking and the air was thudding. An uninterrupted grumbling thunder descended upon the German lines. Obviously, the enemy were trying to destroy the minefields of our trench system, extended fourfold, and to flatten trenches and shatter bunkers. The only things dangerous to us in the company bunker were the shells dropping very close by, of which there were not a few. The whistling, rushing, and crashing of shells round about indeed almost drugged the senses. But we were lucky, and along the whole bridge of the nose, we only received a few direct hits in the trench and none on the bunker. I got the impression that the Russians were sparing the Nars. Even the advanced observers of the artillery and our heavy weapons company beside my command post remained untouched. After exactly 2 hours, the bombardment suddenly broke off. A paralyzing calm fell over the front. It meant that the Russians were moving their fire forward in order not to endanger their attacking infantry. "Raus," I ordered, and that meant going into position in the small trench system around the company command post. All nervousness had fallen away from me. The patient waiting in the bunker was at an end. We could see and deal with the enemy. Outside there was fog, but it was the powder smoke from the massive amount of exploded shells that had dropped on our positions. I thought that I could not believe my eyes when on the right I saw that the second company had already retreated a long way. I then saw the enemy rapidly advancing in battalion strength onto the second trench. The Russians went round my company and cut us off. But from the left, charging at the company command post, there came the left wing of a confused brown wave, approaching unstoppably with cries of "Hurrah!" But the most shattering thing about the picture was the fact that individual German soldiers were running away in front of the assaulting Red Army troops. They were wobbling with exhaustion, without weapons and equipment, plainly at the end of their strength. But we had to fire, even at the risk of our comrades thinking that we were firing at them. So I carefully took aim at the Russians storming up behind them. They had in the meantime approached to within 100 meters of us. In the feeling of desperation that there was no way that we could escape from that dire position, other than dead or as prisoners, an uncanny calm came over me. As I had learned as a recruit in our much vilified drill, I took aim and fired, disappeared behind the parapet after firing, then quick as a flash popped up again a little to one side, and got the next enemy in the sights of my Sturmgewehr. I succeeded in hitting enemy officers and machine gunners. They were clearly recognizable, especially the officers, by the arm movements with which they accompanied their already audible orders. Thus, as one after the other fell, hit by my bullets, I was seized by a triumphant savage pleasure, and by the hope of escaping once more. I watched one of the men I shot, stepping on persistently with his head lowered. Then he was hit by my bullet. Slowly he struck his chest with his hand and finally fell forward. That picture will never leave me as long as I live. The miracle happened. The targeted fire from my rifle and those of the runners brought the attack to a standstill. The Red Army troops went to ground. Then, pursued by our bullets, they drew back far to the rear and sought to connect up again to the forces on their right. We had lost our connections both to the right and to the left, because the Russians had already pushed forward a long way. Meanwhile, my platoons had left the trench. They gathered in a line, one man behind another, in the secondary trench leading to the command post. I gave orders immediately to go back into position. There was no more immediate danger just then, for the very reason that the enemy was not at all concerned about us. However, the longer-term situation seemed hopeless. Sooner or later, we would certainly fall into enemy hands. I was still considering how we could get out of that wretched situation when, on the right from the sector of the 3rd Battalion, infantry fire could be heard. It could mean nothing other than that our battalion had held its position. It must therefore be possible to connect up to the 3rd Battalion via the abandoned sector of the 2nd Company. There was no longer any wireless contact with our own battalion. Even the advanced observers had evidently been able to withdraw in time. so I had to make the decision to remain in the position or to connect up on the right to the 3rd Battalion. I decided on the latter course because it seemed to me to be unlikely that the position could be held. It could also be assumed that orders would be given during the night to evacuate the main line of resistance, insofar as it was still occupied by our people. In the light of that, it seemed unimportant from which point the company should begin its withdrawal. Since the waves of the enemy had rolled past us on the right and on the left, I gave orders to withdraw along the main trench to the right towards the 3rd Battalion. The Oberfähnrich took the lead, and I myself remained at the rear. Like the captain of a sinking ship, I was the last to leave my company sector. An enemy reserve company spotted our withdrawal, changed its direction and made moves to attack us. A particularly dashing group was storming up at a run outside the trenches, while my company was withdrawing hurriedly along the trench to the right. To make the withdrawal easier, I formed a rearguard with a machine gun and the 2 runners. With care, I picked out again the nearest of the attackers. When they felt our resistance, they left off their pursuit. It was doubtless not part of their immediate task. Eventually, there only remained a short length of trench to overcome, in which there were Russians. We managed it with a few shouts and a short hurrah. It was easy because for the most part they were wounded and the group had no leader. We even took prisoner some slightly wounded troops and chased others away. Those who were seriously wounded we left alone. Soon we had connected up with the 3rd Battalion. The men took a breath and I went to the battalion command post. The commander, Hauptmann Delansky, greeted me with words of recognition for our achievement. He immediately reported our arrival to the regiment through the still intact telephone line. All that remained of my strength deserted me, and I could almost have fallen asleep. I really had to pull myself together, so as not to give in to exhaustion. Towards dusk, a captive Russian captain was brought into the bunker. An active officer, about 25 years old, he said he had never been in action before. He had only arrived a few days previously with an entire division from Siberia. Through this and other information, we slowly formed a proper idea of the inexhaustible reserves of the enemy. The 3rd line of trenches, to which we had had to withdraw during the night, ran along the back of a slope. In front of us was some woodland. On the right of it, about 600 metres away, there was a single farmhouse surrounded by fruit trees. As we could see from their movements, the Russians had already reached the edge of the woodland. Our trench was continuous and well constructed and excellently camouflaged with snow. We ourselves, as we moved into it from the edge of the woodland, had only noticed it when it was a few metres away. We must have only settled down in it for an hour, when out of the woodland came 2 Russians who briskly and unconcernedly walked towards our trench. They had machine pistols slung around their necks and were walking comfortably side by side, almost as if they were whistling a little song. They came to within 200 metres, to within 100 metres and even nearer, without having noticed our trench in front of them. I quietly gave the order to let them approach and to take them prisoner. 50 metres away from us, they slowed their steps. 20 German voices shouted "Stoi," whereupon they turned round and ran back, weaving as they went. In the hail of bullets, they collapsed. I had not anticipated that. They must have been riddled with bullets. Some time after that period of cruelty and bitterness, there was movement at the farm. As a result of it, the enemy artillery opened up and obediently dropped shells on us. I scanned the farm with my binoculars and discovered the advanced observers. There were 2 men with wireless sets, whose heads, shoulders and equipment could be seen behind low cover. I asked to be handed a rifle with a telescopic sight and for a runner to observe through the binoculars. Then I pushed myself carefully over the parapet of the trench and calmly took aim. There was a soft pressure as I fired. The observer's head sank onto the cover, and that of the second man disappeared. My runner saw through the binoculars the dead man being dragged back into cover. An hour later came the order to evacuate the position. In the meantime, another Russian artillery observer had taken over directing the fire, which unfortunately was so accurate that we had some casualties. A position as well constructed as the 4th line, in which we spent the night of the 17th of January, I had never seen. The bunkers were as much as 3 metres below ground level. The trench had been dug out to the height of a man. It was provided with secondary trenches and in places with rails. The rifle positions and machine gun nests were tactically in the correct places. It could not have been better in the trench warfare of the First World War. So this was the so-called Gauleiterstellung, which led over 1,000 kilometers along the eastern border of the Reich. It had been built in autumn 1944 by women and girls who were either volunteers or on war service, under the direction of officers who had been injured in the war. On the Oder, even Gisela had participated with pickaxe and shovel in that massive project. From my perspective in the trenches, the position, apart from some buildings that should have been blown up, was an ideal one in which to spend the winter. Not a spadeful more could be dug out of the frozen ground. The Poelin position, with its trenches in places only knee-deep, bore no comparison to this one. But I had no feeling of confidence. Even though I had no overview of the wider situation, I did not reckon on staying there long. My feeling had not deceived me. After sleeping for a few hours in deep exhaustion, I had woken up. At dawn, I emerged from the bunker. The houses in front of the position, 50 meters away, made me nervous. As it came light, movement could be seen. It turned out that there were some individual Russians in the houses, and that more were moving in. In ones and twos, they came running over the bridge which led over a stream on the other side of the farmyard. I had the machine gun spray the bridge, whereupon in the background a movement to the left along the stream could be seen. After quite a long time, individual rifle fire sounded from the neighbouring sector to our left. The direction of it moved more and more obliquely to the rear in our direction of retreat. While it was gradually becoming light, the enemy were also advancing on the right about 1 kilometre away. We were threatened with encirclement. Our neighbours on both sides crumbled. They left their trenches and withdrew, widely separated. The battalion commander, Hauptmann Wild, could not decide to evacuate that magnificent position without orders. There was neither telephone nor wireless connection to our regiment. In view of the threatened encirclement, it seemed crazy to stay in the position. Behind it stretched several kilometres of open plain, offering no kind of protection. To withdraw across it in daylight would involve heavy casualties. No runner came from the regiment who might have brought the order we were waiting for. The pale day brightened, and the rifle fire behind us to the left became more concentrated. Hauptmann Wild waited and brooded. To surrender the position without the enemy attacking was a decision with far-reaching consequences. Even apart from the possibility of court-martial proceedings, the order to evacuate meant giving up trenches and bunkers of such good quality as we had never had before. Even if the enemy had dug in on the other slope of the bank, only 100 or 150 meters away, this would still not have been any close-quarters corner, such as we had in October in the Budy-Obrebsky position. At the company commander's meeting, I pressed for the order to withdraw to be given. I pointed out that otherwise, if there were any further delay, the battalion of nearly 150 men would be lost. Hauptmann Wild came to his decision. We climbed out of the trenches and moved off over the wide, snow-covered field. While the battalion was retreating in open order, suddenly bursts of fire from machine guns and machine pistols hit the right flank. There were Russians in a small trench system, not 30 meters away from me. Men hit by the bullets were collapsing all around. One cried out that we should take him with us. Who could have done that? Everybody was running, and in long jumping strides I ran along with them. Then suddenly there was a blow against my head. As I was running, I was spun round. I fell and pulled myself together again. My head was thumping, but I felt that I was not wounded. Stumbling, I ran on, zigzagging across the expanse when there was no cover. After some 100 meters, the commanders were able to bring their units under control and to change the running flight into an orderly retreat. At the end of the fields lay the next settlement. A machine pistol barked out from there, and a voice going haywire was shouting out. Both weapon and voice belonged to Oberst Dorn, who was firing in the air over our heads in order to halt the retreating troops and bring them into their positions. "You Schweinehunde, will you stand still?" he roared, although this was not necessary. I had never seen the Oberst, this quiet and kindly man, so excited. Clearly he had not seen and did not know anything of the retreat of our neighbouring units, and nothing of the enemy machine gun fire that had hit us from the flank as we were retreating. but the Oberst was fair and experienced enough to immediately grasp the situation and not to hold us responsible for it. He knew that in the 6th year of the war, the troops were already too worn out to be able to make anything of a situation such as this. Lengthy retreats demoralize any troops, as had been seen in the summer of 1944. There, on the Russian front, was added a massive momentum not present on the other fronts, apart perhaps from the partisan war in the Balkans. It was the fear of being taken prisoner, the fear of falling into the hands of an inhuman enemy. Goebbels' propaganda had a boomerang effect. The bitterness with which the war was waged against Bolshevik Russia marked it out as a struggle between personal deadly enemies. The disregard of the Red Cross, the news of the atrocities carried out by the advancing Red Army, all this had long since extinguished the chivalry practiced in earlier wars. However, it seemed to be still present on the other fronts in the West and South. Two ideologies were battling it out. The protagonists knew that the conflict would only end with the destruction of one or the other. In the East, it had never been a decent war. One notable thing was that on the evening of the 17th of January 1945, quite against my usual careless custom, I had put on my steel helmet instead of my field service cap. An indeterminate but compelling feeling had made me do it. When I was at last able to take off my steel helmet, I saw the reason for it. The bludgeoning blow that had thrown me to the ground came from an infantry gun. It had very nearly penetrated the helmet, but the inserts of sheet steel and leather had stopped it from going right through. From the beginning of the large-scale offensive on the 14th until the 20th of January, we had carried out a fighting withdrawal of almost 70 kilometers. We had to take up positions in front of the little town of Bielsk. Since only the commander, Hauptmann Wild, had a map, the process of directing us into our positions was a very long-winded affair. Also, the allocation of sectors did not seem to be quite right. Wild drove for a long time in a regimental vehicle around the district in order to find the right sector. We had to shift sideways. He had already directed away half the battalion, then went to find it and did not come back. The adjutant, Oberleutnant Kullenberg, and I remained behind, as the only officers, with the other half of the battalion. It was a bright and sunny winter's day with good visibility over a long distance. We were standing on the top of a gentle rise, parallel to which, and some 700 meters to the left, to the south, ran the road to Bielsk, 4 kilometers away. To the right of it, 1 to 2 kilometers further on, at a right angle to the first road, another road led to the town. Two small areas of woodland lay between. On the latter road, which could not easily be observed, enemy tanks were advancing, to judge by the noise they were making. But on the left, one brown lorry after another, carrying anti-tank guns or infantry, rolled in the direction of Bielsk. Kullenberg and I considered our position. As it later turned out, a battalion runner sent by Hauptmann Wild had not got through. In the meantime, it had got to 3 p.m. Getting on for 30 lorries had already driven past us, and on the right, to judge by the noise, at least as many tanks. So our only option was to withdraw, to lie up in the nearest woodland, and to wait for the approaching darkness. In 2 hours it would be dusk, and after that it would quickly become dark. To the woodland it was 1 kilometer. In between there was a village. We moved through it in column, widely separated. The few inhabitants, mostly old people, observed us with indifferent faces. They may have felt pleased that we were retreating, but also uncertain as to what was going to happen. Not far behind the village we reached the protection of the woodland. Russians travelling to Bielsk on the road to the left of us seemed to have a definite destination. Although they must have been able to see us, they left us alone. Possibly they thought that we were their own people. That gave me an idea. When we arrived in the woodland, sentries were posted at its edges, and then we began to get changed. The winter clothing that we were wearing over our uniform was white on one side and covered on the other with brownish-green camouflage patterns. At a distance it could not be distinguished from the brown cloth of the Russian uniforms. So we turned our uniforms inside out. Brown on the outside, we had a better chance of being taken for Russians and not being recognized. Till darkness fell, we remained undisturbed. Then a tense operation began. Everyone stuck closely to his neighbour as we stepped through the snow. We could touch no village, no farm. The aim was to push through the most forward enemy lines in a wide arc around Bielsk, and thus reach our own lines. A critical point would be the road on which the tanks had been advancing. Now and again we could still hear the sound of engines from there. Before we set off, Kullenberg and I had looked at each other. The question as to who would be able to keep it up remained unsaid. After an hour of wading through the snow, we reached the road. Firelight shone from farmhouses. They were already occupied by the enemy. While the men, distributed in the nearest hollows, were under cover, Kullenberg and I stalked our way forward to the road, the broad tracks of the enemy. T-34 tanks had left deep tracks in the snow. On the road there was no traffic. The opportunity was favourable. We brought up the men and our crossing was successful. On the other side of the road we began afresh the process of creeping up between the farms. We approached to within only 50 metres of one of them. In the light of a fire, Russians were making themselves comfortable. They were cooking and roasting, making a noise, and felt quite safe. We, on the other hand, refrained from doing anything that would give us away, in order not to endanger our goal of reaching the German lines. Almost 2 hours later, we found ourselves to the southwest of the town. We had almost described a semicircle around it when a village came into sight. According to the distance and the noise of the fighting during the day, the Russians could have only got this far. We halted once again, and Kullenberg and I crept alone into the village. In a ditch at the side of the road we took cover and waited until we saw people, friend or foe. We waited a while and consulted in whispers. Suddenly 2 chaps came along the road, in fur caps and snow jackets with telephone equipment round their neck, evidently Russians. Since they had to pass quite close to us, and would anyway see us in the light of the snowy evening, there was only one thing left for us to do, namely to let them come to within a few metres of us, and then take care of them. Walking side by side they approached us, suspecting nothing and without a care in the world. When they were quite close we jumped up, our assault rifles at the ready, and shouted Ruki Yurch. The 2 of them were completely taken by surprise and raised their hands in the air. Then one of them, when he had recovered from the shock, said, "Oh God, Herr Leutnant, you didn't half give me a fright." So we relaxed a bit. The 2 of them were Strippenhengster, that is signals troops from our artillery regiment. They had to check the telephone lines to an advanced observer, who was supposed to be somewhere further forward, that is, where we had come from. That meant that without noticing it, we had successfully crossed the lines with our 80 men. Both sides had, in view of the darkness, evidently called it a day, with the occupation of farms and houses. Hauptmann Wild and the other half of the battalion were soon found. After such adventures, it was the greatest pleasure to put the first cigarette in your mouth. Inhale the first pull at it, then to be able to breathe out again. I had begun to smoke when I was at grammar school, and father, who was a non-smoker, had had no objection to it. On the contrary, and this reinforced my habit, he had spoken of comrades in the First World War who were smokers and who in critical situations kept or found their calm with the help of tobacco. That night there was still a few hours' rest to be had on a German estate. I was sitting with some men in the library of the house and found there Stefan Zweig's Sternstunden der Menschheit. I read for a little while, sitting in an armchair, until my eyelids closed and my head sank backwards. In order to relieve the strain of the winter retreat, we received orders to requisition farm vehicles. Affected by this were the Polish farmers who had remained on their farmsteads, while the Germans with their heavily loaded carts had already fled. The farmer from whom I had taken 2 nags together with his light vehicles complained a lot. The unit commander, in accordance with the Hague Convention on Land Warfare, had to issue a written receipt for the requisitioned goods, but it was no use to the poor farmer. Nor was it of any help to him that the interpreter told him that the whole of Poland, when the Russians occupied that country, would long to be back with the Germans. We, however, if we were not actually in combat, could load machine guns and boxes of ammunition on the vehicles, and now and again one of us could rest his weary body. On the 23rd of January, Oberleutnant Kullenberg was shot in the stomach. Apart from the commander, I was then the last officer in the battalion. As we were withdrawing during the day in open order, I had fallen through the ice while crossing a frozen stream. The water had got into the felt lining of my boots. I either marched along in wet boots, with my feet to a certain extent warm, or if I was not moving, they got cold and threatened to freeze to the soles. The following night brought me the craziest experience of that winter retreat. I had received orders to take over command of the rearguard. Who else could have done this, since there was no other officer there anyway? I had bent over the Hauptmann's map, the only one in the battalion, and with clammy fingers had dug out of the map case a pencil and a little slip of paper. Out loud to myself, I had spelled out the unpronounceable Polish place names and written them on the slip of paper. A few lines, an arrow pointing north, and the sketch was ready. The runner Buck had similarly had to look at the sketch, and then I reported my departure. Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Hauptmann, Lieutenant Scheidebauer reporting his departure, I had said in a fairly unmilitary fashion, and Wilde had replied, "Go with God, my boy, go." The company of only 14 remaining men sat in the overheated room of a farmhouse warming themselves before the 20-kilometre night march, or rather, journey. The 14 chaps comfortably fitted on the vehicles, so that it was clear that their feet could be protected. The entire battalion was motorised in this way with the help of 10 such combat vehicles. The head of the column set off, and I remained behind with 2 vehicles as rearguard. It was a dark, almost mild night, and we were not freezing to any great extent. No wonder that the men dozed and dropped off, and seemingly the horses did too. Then suddenly the penultimate vehicle had driven into a ditch, and the men on it, woken up with a shock, were only just able to jump down from the vehicle as it tipped over. Dopey sod. They cursed the driver, and wretched nag was how he cursed his horse. Of course, the men pushed the vehicle back out of the ditch again, loaded the ammunition boxes back onto it, pulled up their hoods and sat back on it. They were annoyed about the 10 minutes the accident had lost, and the fact that by then they had lost touch with the battalion. We drove on and the men dozed on. But I stayed awake, lit up my sketch with the glowing tip of my cigarette, took compass bearings, and waited for the left-hand fork in the road leading westwards. But it didn't come. We drove past a brightly lit farmhouse in front of which a lorry was standing. "So we're not last," said one of the men. The situation slowly began to seem suspicious to me, because we had already gone too far northwards. But suddenly we heard vehicles in front of us that must come from the battalion. Out of the darkness, the outlines of houses emerged. It was doubtless a village in which the battalion was waiting for its rear guard. The distance became less and less, and the outlines of buildings, trees, and vehicles became clearer and clearer. These must also come from other units. We overtook some, until an obstacle brought us to a halt. I jumped down in order to look with the runner for Hauptmann Wilde. We passed figures shrouded in white, and were suddenly asked in Russian, "Well, who are you?" I assumed that the man asking the question was a Russian Hilfswilliger, many of whom served with our baggage train, and had paid no more attention to him. But then the chap had moved his hand in a suspicious way, and was holding a weapon in it. My runner, the medic, suddenly planted one on his chin. Bellowing loudly and falling backwards, he shouted, "Germansky! Germansky!" Shots cracked out and shouts rang out. There was complete confusion in the Russian baggage train into which we had stumbled. No one could recognize anyone else in the darkness. I shouted out, "Into the fields." We had to get away from the village street and the vehicles. The only option open to us was the field to the left of the road, because on the right the road was blocked. Franz stuck close to me. The other men were swallowed up in the snow and the night. After an hour of strenuous searching and muffled shouting, we had only found 7 of the 14. Then we set off, without vehicles and without machine guns. I could not hold up any longer if I wanted to avoid being seen when it got light. It was the only time during my time as a soldier that I lost my bearings at night. The sky was cloudy and the pole star could not be seen, and my sense of direction let me down. I was convinced that the west was in the east, but my compass showed the opposite. I wavered between which I should trust, my instinct that had never yet let me down, or the compass. Then reason and drill, which were the stronger, won through, and trust in the compass saved us. We were stamping through the snow in the direction my compass showed as west. From time to time we had to wade up to our knees through the snow. At last a farmstead came in sight. There we had to ask the way. Fortunately, I had written down the place names along our retreat. I could not send any of the men still shocked by the experience to the farm, so I went again with Franz. While the rest of the group waited near a tree that we hoped to be able to find later, Franz and I, with the safety catches off our weapons, crept closer. A dog set off barking, but from the house there was neither light nor any sound to be heard. We knocked on the window and on the door until an anxious farmer opened up. Were there any Russians here yet? The Upper Silesian Franz asked him in Russian, to which the Pole replied, "No, you are the first." Smiling to ourselves, we got him to tell us the way to the road and the names of the next villages. Soon we had found the road again. Just as it was becoming light, we at last found the battalion in the third village. With the help of Hauptmann Wild's map, I had to establish that we had missed the fork in the road by 5 kilometers. At the regiment and at the division, they were agitated when they found out, on the basis of my report, that enemy baggage trains were already in the village where we had had our adventure. On the 25th of January, we had come to within 10 kilometers of the Vistula to the south of the town of Graudenz. From midnight there was a 2-hour halt. After that we were to march on again. Since the enemy was not pushing up behind, we only had to take normal security precautions. There was enough time to knock up a decent stew for the men. The farmhouse in which we were had been deserted by its inhabitants. They had fled. But the stock was still there. 2 men who knew how to do it hurriedly slaughtered a pig. The portions we needed were cut out, the rest was left. The Ivans could make a good meal of it if it had not become inedible by that time. In a massive pan that the farmer's wife must have used at harvest time and at celebrations, the pieces of meat simmered in such a way as to make our mouths water. Outside it remained quiet, and we were lucky enough to be able to eat our fill until we left. After 3 hours' slow night march, we crossed the frozen Vistula. Pioneers had reinforced it to form an ice bridge, so that tanks and heavy artillery could also get across it. At 5 a.m. in the area of Deutsch Westfalen, I set my foot on the western bank. The positions ran along the riverbank on the Vistula embankment. On the western bank, a strip of meadows about 1 to 3 kilometers wide, then ran along the river, ending in a steeply climbing hill. About 10 kilometers northeastwards was the town of Graudenz, with the visible silhouette of its fortress. Called after the Prussian general Corbière, it stood high above the Vistula.